This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. In particular, this month is being sponsored by Lindsay Marie Trebet and Nick Martin. I thank you both so very much. And if you want to become a patron, you can do so at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I am very happy to have Mr. Lewis Proud on the line with me. How you doing, Lewis?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And thanks for having me on the show, Seriah.
I have been wanting to have you on the show for a while, as I told you. And I'm really happy that you've written this new book, Borderland Phenomena, Volume 1, Spontaneous Combustion, Poltergeistry, and Anomalous Lights. I love the word poltergeistry, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yep.
This is a fantastic book, and it's put out through August Night Books. And it's, I assume, one of numerous volumes?
Yeah, that's correct. So it's called Volume 1, and there's I'm currently doing research for Volume 2, so there could be even more volumes after that. So yeah, it's certainly going to be a series. That's the intention anyway.
Okay, and you define Borderland as what?
Right. So the term borderland, so when I use that term, I'm referring to things that lie on the border or edge of this reality, things that are neither here nor there, but somewhere in between, and things that could also be termed liminal, and that's comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. Mm-hmm. So I'm referring to things that lie on the border or edge or threshold of this reality, and it also it's also related to my belief that there are other universes besides ours. I think there's very strong evidence that we do, in fact, inhabit a multiverse. And a lot of these paranormal events, UFOs, sightings of ghosts, etc., I think there's good evidence that we're really sort of witnessing things that have their origin in another reality, like a parallel world, if you like, and they're things that occasionally spill over or bleed through into our world. And of course, you'd be familiar with the term that John Keel coined, which is window area. And that sort of really is referring to locations where there seem to be, frequent sightings of UFOs, etc. And the idea, of course, is that the veil between worlds, if you like, is thinner at those locations, and hence we see these things that we don't normally see. The other thing too is I also avoid the term supernatural, and that really means beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. I believe that nothing is beyond scientific understanding or the laws of nature. We just simply, we're not equipped to be able to understand those things at this point in time. Of course, future scientists may find out the answers to some of these things. That's the hope anyway. But certainly there's nothing that's outside of nature. We are dealing with, natural phenomena. But, if we imagine nature in the form of a circle, we could say that the things that we do understand are at the center of that circle. The things that we don't quite understand are sort of at the margins or border of that circle. So, when I use the term borderland, it's really a metaphor that's, I think quite a powerful metaphor to try and communicate, what the paranormal is all about.
Yeah. And that liminality plays such a part in this type of stuff too. I mean, you when you're experiencing liminality in your life is when the paranormal tends to pop up as well.
Yeah, that's correct. And another thing I wanted to talk about too is sleep paralysis, because that's one of the things that really sort of, set me down this path of exploring the paranormal. I, of course, wrote a book about sleep paralysis. It's called Dark Intrusions, an investigation into the paranormal nature of sleep paralysis experiences. So it's something that I started to experience from quite a young age. It would have been in my sort of late teens, and then up until my early 20s, I had very frequent sleep paralysis experiences. And of course, sleep paralysis experiences occur in that liminal state of consciousness between being awake and being asleep. It's sometimes called, of course, the hypnagogic state or hypnopompic state, depending on whether you're emerging from consciousness or just falling asleep. And certainly too, in that state, of course, you can have all sorts of really bizarre experiences. You can sense a presence. You can sometimes experience tactile things as well, where basically you feel as though you're being touched by an entity of some kind. You can sense a presence. It's usually a malevolent presence. And of course, sleep paralysis also crosses over with other things like out-of-body experiences and lucid dreaming, etc. So once again, we see the paranormal manifesting during that liminal state of consciousness. And also too, in poltergeist events, we find that that often the rapping noises that people hear, they also occur just as family members are either waking up or falling asleep. So once again, during that liminal state, that's when the paranormal seems to manifest.
Definitely. And with sleep paralysis too, and this will make we'll connect to stuff later on. We've done quite a few shows with sleep paralysis, and there seems to occasionally be electrical elements to it.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, certainly there's when we use the term electric people, these of course are people who seem to have all sorts of difficulties with electrical equipment. You of course have a good understanding of it. We were just talking about electric people before, and some of the people that who have this issue. You said that you yourself have it.
Yeah.
And yeah, we do find too that people who seem to sort of experience sort of frequent paranormal events, they are electric people, and they have difficulties with one thing that is very common is that when they wear a watch, it seems to malfunction. So a lot of these people say that they can't wear a wristwatch because it just suddenly malfunctions and that sort of thing. And we do find too that these people they've experienced some kind of shock. Generally happens in childhood. I find they've experienced either some kind of psychological shock, or they have literally been shocked by electricity. So that's very common. So there's all these characteristics, and it seems to be very consistent with what these people experience. So certainly, yeah, people who are electric people, who've had that experience of either being shocked by electricity, etc., or suffered some kind of psychological shock, they do seem to they seem to have frequent paranormal experiences. And certainly a friend of mine, Whitley Strieber, he of course talked about this as well. He said that he had difficulties with street lights. So he would be. Yeah, exactly. So, street lamp interference. So it's very common for him to be, he'll be walking around, he'll pass a street light, it'll suddenly blink out, or just sort of malfunction in some sort of inexplicable manner. So really fascinating stuff.
But this book starts off in a place that seems completely disconnected from that. And you do some really interesting work here. It starts off with spontaneous human combustion, and I think most people listening to this show are aware of what spontaneous human combustion is, but I'm not sure if they understand just how much the body, like what is different between spontaneous human combustion and say like cremation.
Yeah, right. So I should probably just start off just by sort of defining what it is. So basically, it's an unexplained phenomenon whereby the human body is basically almost entirely reduced to ash. Generally occurs within a period of around 10 to 12 hours, although it's hard to put a time frame on it in some cases, because maybe the body hasn't been discovered for days. It may have been there for a long period of time. It generally sort of targets the elderly, people who are sick and unwell and elderly, people who, of course, are quite isolated socially as well. And sometimes, though, there will be, sort of one or two limbs that remain completely untouched. You'll find, of course, I mean, in the famous Mary Hardy Reisa case, basically her left foot was still intact, and in fact the slipper was still on the foot as well. So, but basically, in the case of cremation, a huge amount of energy is used in order to reduce the body to that state. So we're talking about quite a high temperature that's required to cremate the body. It's around about 760 to 1,150 degrees Celsius. And that's to vaporize and oxidize the body. It takes around sort of 90 minutes to 2 hours to achieve that. But even in the case of cremation, and I should also point out that they're using, fuels such as oil, gas, etc. There's also forced air is used to increase the temperature. So a great deal of energy is used to reduce the body to that state. And even then, we find that there's still, quite large fragments of bone that remain. So the body hasn't been entirely reduced to ash. And then they use a machine called a cremulator, which is basically kind of like a sort of a blender with these large ball bearings that they spin around, and they crush the bones up and turn them into a fine powder. So that's what's required to reduce a body to that state. The human body, of course, is around 65% water. It is very, very difficult to burn a body. So the mystery of SHC is where does the energy come from, and what is the process by which that's achieved to basically transform the body to that state. So that's really the sort of the crux of the matter, and that's why it's such a big mystery.
Yeah. And the Mary Reeser case is one you give quite a bit of attention to. And is that the first one you kind of like looked into?
Yeah, exactly. So this is really one of the most famous and fascinating cases of SHC. Mary Reeser, of course, is sometimes referred to as the Cinder Woman. She was a 67-year-old widow. She lived in Columbia in Pennsylvania before moving to St. Petersburg in Florida. The reason that she moved there was to be closer to her son and his family. She, of course, was the widow of a doctor, and she was quite lonely at that point in time after she'd lost her husband. So she wanted to be closer to family members. The only thing is she completely despised Florida. She lived in St. Petersburg in Florida, and she couldn't stand the heat and humidity. So she was very unhappy in Florida. She'd been living in a apartment there for about 5 weeks when the event itself occurred. And this was the night of July 1st or 2nd in 1951. And basically her whole body was reduced to ash, apart from her left foot, of course, which I said was still clad in its slipper. There was also like a chunk of backbone. And there was also her purportedly shrunken skull remaining as well. So everything had been reduced to ash apart from those few body parts. And of course, the chair on which she'd been seated, she was seated on an easy chair, that was also reduced to ash as well. Apart from, of course, the metal components, the springs, and so forth. But it's a really, really fascinating case, and the other thing that we find too in cases of SHC is that surrounding objects, and in this case there were stacks of newspapers and that sort of thing. There was also like a daybed just a few feet away from her body, which was also unmarked. And in the case of the newspapers, they were completely, they weren't even scorched at all. There was a lot of course, moist soot. The apartment itself was very smoke blackened and covered in soot. That was just from about 4 feet above the ground. The rest, or below that height, it was more or less unaffected, which of course was quite strange as well. But what happened is she was living there in this apartment. She wasn't in contact with a lot of people. The last two people who saw her alive were her landlady, Pansy Carpenter, and her son, Richard Jr., and they, of course, had seen her the night before. And she was last seen just sort of basically seated in her chair. She had taken some mild sedatives that evening. She was in the habit of taking mild sedatives. The theory is, of course, that she was a smoker, that she'd been smoking in her chair. She'd sort of more or less kind of passed out, I suppose. She was heavily sedated, and she dropped the cigarette. The cigarette had then caught fire to her chair. So that's what the police concluded. But that, of course, doesn't explain really what happened because, of course, as I said, the fire was very localized, which is very strange. And if there had been that amount of heat involved to reduce her to that state, then we have to ask why, it didn't completely burn down the apartment. Why was it just sort of restricted to that very small area?
Yeah.
And basically, her landlady had that morning she'd gone in to check on the old lady, and she'd because a telegram had arrived. She went to take it to her apartment, and then she knew that something was up when she smelt smoke, and she touched the the screen door, the metal handle. It was actually hot to the touch. He was a physical anthropologist. He was an expert on what happens to the human body when it's been exposed to fire. He'd done all sorts of experiments with cadavers, where he tried to basically burn bodies using various methods, various fuels, and that kind of thing. So he was a real expert on it. He'd coincidentally been vacationing near St. Petersburg at the time that it happened, and so he was following the case, and he was also asked to offer his expertise on the case as well, and he was completely baffled by it. He said that he'd never heard of anything like it. And there's a fascinating quote here that I'd just like to read out. So he said, "I've been present at tests of body and bone reaction to extreme heat, and it's been established that heat of about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is around 1,650 degrees Celsius, is necessary to completely consume the bones, as happened in the Risa case. I cannot conceive of such complete cremation without more burning of the apartment itself." So he was a world-leading expert on this, as I said, what happens to the human body when exposed to fire, and he himself was completely baffled by the case. So I think that's very telling that it was a deeply mysterious incident.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of explanations for this stuff. Obviously, one being that someone was smoking and it lit them up, but that doesn't fit the criteria whatsoever. I mean, most of the explanations don't really fit the criteria. The closest one that debunkers will throw out there is the wick effect.
Yeah, that's correct. So the wick effect theory is the the theory that all of the skeptics use to try and explain away these incidents, and basically the theory is that the human body is similar in nature to a candle. So they sort of compare the human body to a candle, but an inside-out candle where the clothing represents the wick, and the fat of the body is the fuel. And the theory is that in cases of SHC, or alleged cases of SHC, what happens is the person is exposed to, say, maybe, as I said, it could be a drop cigarette, it could be a hot ember from a fire or something of that nature. So there's something there that catches fire to their clothing, and basically the fire then it melts the fat on the body, and then that sort of the fat is then drawn into the clothing, in the manner of a wick, and then the body continues to burn in that manner. So it's kind of a smoldering type of effect. And they have done experiments with pig carcasses and that sort of thing, where they've basically wrapped the pig in a blanket. Now, in these experiments, they always had to use some kind of accelerant to try and get the fire started. So they would, of course, douse the pig in petrol or something of that nature.
Right.
And so that's how these experiments work. They've done these experiments, but we find that it's what's been observed is really not very convincing at all, because we certainly don't see the same effects as we do in cases of SHC. The body is not burnt to the same extent. There's just not as much heat involved. So these pig carcass experiments have been very, very disappointing. But even so, that's what the skeptics use to try and explain SHC. It's always the wick effect. And maybe certainly, some cases of SHC can be explained in that manner, but certainly not all. But
Right.
there's certainly so many theories to try and explain SHC.
And like the wick effect explains some of the criteria, but it does not explain. It doesn't explain the ignition angle. Period.
No, exactly. And we also find cases of SHC where there have been, witnesses who have seen, a loved one or a friend basically just sort of literally burst into flames right before their eyes. And, the fire did certainly seem to come from within the body as well, which is the other thing. So it does seem to be very much a spontaneous process, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of external source of ignition as claimed, in the case of the wick effect theory.
Yeah, and you talk about a couple of cases where people have survived spontaneous human combustion, and also cases where people have seen actual flames coming out of their own body. And when we've done shows on electrical people and stuff and Kundalini, I've had people tell me they've had experiences, like just a small handful, have had experiences where they saw flames coming out of themselves or their partner at some point where they had to try and extinguish them. Which has always led to me thinking that this could possibly be a partial explanation for this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's certainly it's very compelling. Certainly, my take on it is that we're dealing with certainly an electrical phenomenon, because of course the body does have its own electrical system. There of course are there's all of our thoughts and actions and so on are characterized by some kind of electrochemical process, in the way of nerve impulses, etc. So there's all this electrical activity in the body. The body, as I said, has its own electrical system, and we don't, of course, understand everything there is to understand about that system. So in the case of SHC, we could be dealing with some kind of malfunction within the body's electrical system that then, causes that heat to be generated and the body to burst into flames. And I think it all comes down to the person's state of consciousness. There's a fascinating theory that was discussed by Vincent Gaddis in his book, Mysterious Fires and Lights. And he basically compared SHC to poltergeistry. He said that in the case of, poltergeist events, there, of course, is always someone at the center of those events, a person who's, well, generally, of course, it's a teenager who's, undergoing puberty, who's, angry, frustrated, etc. And what seems to happen is the activity seems to originate from their subconscious mind. And the energy is externalized, so it's directed into the external environment, and objects are thrown about. There's rapping noises, etc. So we find all those characteristics, of course, in the case of poltergeists, where, as I said, there's external effects. But in the case of SHC, according to Gaddis, what happens is the energy is internalized. And that causes the person to basically, he describes it as a form of subconscious suicide. So the person has a desire to die subconsciously, and then that triggers the process to occur. And we do find that a lot of these people were quite depressed, lonely individuals. Mary Hardy Reeser, as I said, she was very upset in the weeks leading up to her death. She'd been trying to find an apartment back home in Colombia. She really wanted to get out of St. Petersburg, at least temporarily. and that wasn't the case. So she was quite an unhappy woman. She'd lost her husband as well, as I said. So possibly that she had, willed that to occur on a sort of subconscious level. So I think that's one of the most compelling cases for SHC, the subconscious suicide theory.
Yeah, I had never, that is not something that had ever occurred to me. But
Mm.
the way you lay it out in this book, it makes an enormous amount of sense. You go through great pains to kind of look at it from every angle.
Yep.
And I like the fact that you're very down to earth with it. You're
Mm.
not going off in crazy speculation. You're judging from the facts that we have and pointing out where things are, just theories versus like what the actual facts of like SHC is and everything. Um, and of course, some of the stuff is hard because it's personal experiences from people. A lot of the poltergeist stuff, for instance, is people reporting what they said or what they saw. So I'm wondering if when you have people who survive that they didn't maybe have that suicide wish there, but it's just the
Mm.
electrical activity going crazy,
Yeah.
like from something like Kundalini or something. But yeah, when you have
Mm.
someone who just wants to die and they have that energy, it may
Mm.
just light them up.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And the other thing too is you know, uh, spontaneous combustion in the case of animals seems to be basically non-existent. It really does seem
True.
to be just something that happens to human beings. And so we've got to ask ourselves, what is it that makes human beings unique compared to other animals? And I would say that's, our highly developed consciousness, our minds, is what makes us unique. So that really does seem to sort of lend support to the subconscious suicide theory. So humans are unique because we have these highly developed minds, and that gives rise to hidden powers and abilities as
Hmm.
well. So in the case of SHC, it certainly could be some sort of subconscious impulse that causes it, that triggers that process to occur. So I think, as I said, I think that's the most compelling theory. And I do think too that it's basically the other side of poltergeistry. It's closely related to poltergeistry. It's obviously not the same thing, but it's got to do with where the energy is directed. As I said, Vincent Gaddis said that in the case of SHC, the energy is internalized. With poltergeistry, the energy is externalized. So I think it's definitely linked to poltergeistry as well.
I think a lot of the stuff we don't understand is somehow it
Mm.
seems like poltergeist activity
Yeah.
filters through everything. Like we've remarked numerous times how people go out into the woods to look for Bigfoot and they get stones thrown at them and they hear knocking and they hear vocalizations, but they never see a Bigfoot. But all
Yeah.
those things, including the fact that the stones are warm, are
Mm.
poltergeist, type activity. And we've dubbed that the wilderness poltergeist,
Right.
and so when you look through all this different stuff, poltergeist activity pops up in everything. People who have UFO experiences have poltergeist, stuff. People who have near death experiences
Mm.
have poltergeist activity. It seems to be almost a natural part of our existence that we just don't understand how it works or what it is. I mean, I always took it to be the subconscious PK, but you explored here also the idea that was presented to me by one of my co-hosts that maybe occasionally spirits latch onto that energy and use it for their own means,
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one possibility as well. Of course, that's referred to as like the spirit theory.
Hmm.
It's not a theory that is discussed that much, I suppose, because a lot of people. It's one of the sort of. It's not as respectable as the subconscious
Right.
theory, or the psychological theory, or the psychological angle. But I think there is strong evidence for it as well, that maybe in some cases there is some kind of entity involved that, as you said, does latch onto the person and maybe uses their energy in order to create these disturbances. So this would be some kind of vampiric life form, I suppose, because it's drawing on that person's energy, and it's in a very sort of destructive sort of malevolent kind of way as well, because these certainly aren't positive events. We need to remember that as well. And poltergeist incidents happen in very, usually it's a domestic setting, and usually it happens amongst very depressed, unhappy, unstable individuals. So it seems to be kind of, I suppose, feeding off that energy and that negativity as well. These are, as I said, these are unhappy families, and so there's also that as well, and absolutely, and we do find too that sometimes the activity doesn't really seem to be related so much to any one individual. It seems to, very much take on a will and intelligence of its own. So it seems to behave in a very independent manner as well.
Yeah.
So it doesn't always seem to be necessarily related to the person's subconscious. Maybe it starts off that way, and then it sort of gradually transforms and perhaps becomes more independent. So who knows? Yeah.
Sort of you mentioned this in there, sort of like a tulpa, perhaps.
Yeah, that's one theory as well. That it's that basically they're kind of like thought forms or tulpas. Tulpas. Sorry. So that's one possible explanation as well. That was a theory that D. Scott Rogo. He was a fascinating author and researcher on the paranormal. He discusses that theory in quite some depth in one of his books, the tulpa theory. And he said that we could be dealing with two different types of tulpas. There could be one that's sort of more connected to the person, or more sort of, I suppose, less independent. And then there could be a more advanced tulpa that's sort of more independent and takes on more of a life of its own. And that could explain those poltergeist cases where, as I said, where there seems to be a sort of independent entity involved.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the so this I have a personal experience that actually fits with this. You talk about some of this stuff being a form of static electricity, like the electrical people stuff, relating to static electricity, but being that static electricity is not what we think it is.
Yeah.
And do you explain that a little, and then I'll explain to you one of the experiences I had with this electrical stuff.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I should just point out first of all that a lot of these electric people, they do have issues with static electricity in particular, where their body seems to acquire a very high static charge, and it doesn't seem to be related to them picking up the static from their environment, because certainly if you walk across, say, a carpeted surface on a sort of warm or a dry day when there's very little moisture in the air, sometimes you can pick up quite a big static charge, and then of course you'll touch an object, and like a door handle or something like that, and then it discharges, and then you experience that shock. But in the case of electric people, it seems to be very much a process where the static electricity is generated from within the body. So it just seems it's almost as though there is some kind of malfunction within their electrical system, where they just keep generating static electricity. And of course that could explain too the issues that they have with wearing watches and that kind of thing. And also, if they were to touch a computer or something and there was quite a significant discharge, then certainly they could damage, say, a computer or a device of that nature using just the static charge on their body. And William Reich, he was of course, you've all heard of William Reich. He was he came up, of course, with the theory of orgone energy. And he said that was distinct from electromagnetism. But he basically described static electricity as being a form of orgone energy. So, he said that it's distinct from, sort of current electricity, as we'd find in the case of like, say, a circuit or something like that, like an electrical circuit where a light bulb, is hooked up to a battery or something like that. That's current electricity. Yeah. But and then, of course, static electricity is basically like a particular surface will acquire a static charge. So that there are different types of electricity, but William Reich said that it was really a form of orgone energy.
Hmm.
So maybe we are dealing with some other form of energy that seems to have many of the characteristics of electricity, but which is actually a completely different type of energy. And it could also be related to, what the like the Chinese philosophers called like qi, for example, or
Right. Right.
there's so many different names for it. Mesmer, of course, talked about animal magnetism.
Hmm.
So there's all these ideas of this sort of life force energy, if you like, that the human body that is within the human body, and it is different to what we'd call electromagnetism. So, and it's kind of supposed to be sort of a subtle kind of energy, and that is very difficult to detect, and that sort of requires a I suppose really you need to be sort of a kind of a psychic or intuitive person to sort of kind of understand how it operates within the body,
Right.
because it's a very subtle form of energy. So certainly that could be the case too. We could be dealing with other forms of energy as well. I think we need to, we shouldn't rule out that possibility.
And my my electric stuff started with the Kundalini. The Kundalini,
Hmm.
kicked off, and I mean, I would knock out computers. I would not, and I had at one point a girlfriend who also had massive amounts of Kundalini, and if we like handed the laptop from one to the other, the laptop crashed every single time.
Yeah.
It was very, very consistent with this stuff, but there was one day, and I don't know what was going on, but my electrical, like static electrical stuff, just went through the roof.
Hmm.
And anything I touched, it didn't have to be metal. Anything I touched, I was getting shocks off of, and it was ridiculous. And this kept up for a few days. And I had gone to a radio station to see a friend of mine, and he was the type of person who always liked to shake hands. And I just kind of said to him, I generally had a thing back then where I didn't really touch people because I didn't know what my electrical state was. But at this point, I just flat out told him, "I'm not touching you. Don't touch me. You're going to get a huge shock." And he kind of looked at me weird and just was like, "All right."
Hmm.
And a few minutes later, he went to brush past me, and as he brushed past me, it let off the sound of a gunshot, and it literally threw him across the room.
Yeah. All right.
And he was on the floor a few feet away, just looking at me with his eyes wide open, going, "What was that?" And I'm like, "That's why I told you not to touch me."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was not, we walked out into the hallway, all the lights went out. It was
Mm.
it was ridiculous. And the next day I had gone to another radio station I had a friend at, and when I had put my hand on the metal rack that held all the CD players, I got what felt like when you touch an open outlet, for
Hmm.
just a moment, and then it stopped and all the power went out. But the
All
power
right.
went out all the way down the block,
Mm. Yeah.
and
All
it
right.
didn't come
Okay.
back on. And I said, "Okay, do me a favor, tomorrow, see if you can find out why the power went out." Because if
Hmm.
it had been, someone hit a post or something, or an animal jumped into the transformer or something, okay, well, then that had nothing to do with me. Instead, they told him that the power had gotten a huge surge from somewhere down the line
Hmm.
in the direction of the radio station.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
And after
Fascinating.
that, it stopped. I didn't that was like a one-time thing. It lasted for a few days, and after that knocked the power out. I
Hmm.
hesitate to say it was me because it's such a crazy sounding thing, but
Yeah.
the immense static electricity stopped after that, and I've never had that happen again, and that was back in the 90s.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. Fascinating. Do you think that was related to, because you sort of described it as a kind of a Kundalini awakening that you'd experienced at the time? And I mean, had you been engaging in I suppose certain spiritual practices or anything that may have brought about that sort of Kundalini, awakening type of experience, or
Not when
uh,
so the Kundalini woke up when I was about 12,
okay, yep,
right around puberty, and it started off with slow, like oral and visual hallucinations, and then
hmm,
it's turned into pain, and
Yeah.
electrical feelings, but I had no context for it. I mean, this was the early 1980s,
Yeah.
and it wasn't until the 90s when I think Fate magazine or something had a book on Kundalini in it.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the symptoms going, wait a minute, this is me. And I got the book, and that actually helped me control it a little bit. And once I knew what it was,
Mm.
I was able to kind of get some control over it.
Yeah.
But because I didn't wake it up intentionally, it just woke up on its own. And I found so many people who have had the same thing. One of the
Hmm.
things I'm happy about talking about on the show, that I've talked about it on the show, is that so many people have written me and said, this is what I had, and I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I mean, I also feel too that in the case of sleep paralysis, which I talked about before, I feel that there may have been a sort of a Kundalini awakening component to what I experienced as well. Of course, that did happen, in my late teens, not necessarily around puberty, but it could be related to that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
in these sort of Eastern traditions, of course, they talk about that Kundalini energy as being a sort of, I suppose, a form of kind of sexual energy, a very
Yes.
potent form of sexual energy. And if that's not directed down the proper channels, then it can cause all sorts of kind of side effects of a psychic nature. So I think that's a very interesting angle, a very
Hmm.
interesting way of looking at this stuff as well.
Um, so let's, and I've had poltergeist activity here or there. It just
Mm,
seems to be random. I kind of treat it like it's an outside entity, but I'm fully aware that it's probably coming from me.
yeah.
And it seems very tricksterish, very like it's never been it's never been harmful or anything. It's always been,
Mm,
weird little things that are just annoyances or ridiculous type of stuff. And maybe because I don't feed into it, you know.
yep. Yep.
But you deal with quite a bit of the poltergeist stuff in here, and you do talk about poltergeists causing fires, and that's something that always freaks me out because
Mm.
I'm liable to poltergeist stuff. I'm really glad nothing like that has ever happened.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating aspects of poltergeistry, and it seems to tie into SHC as well. And one of the cases I discuss in quite some detail is the Great Amherst Mystery.
Hmm.
Really famous, fascinating case that occurred in around 1878. It was in Amherst in Nova Scotia in Canada. At the centre of that incident, there was a 19-year-old woman named Esther Cox. But basically, the man who sort of, I suppose, brought this case to the attention of the world was a man named Walter Hubble. He was an actor with an interest in the paranormal. He had earlier looked into mediumship, and he wasn't very impressed because it seemed as though there seemed to be quite a few sort of fraudulent mediums, and he was basically his the reason that he investigated this case is because he wanted to defraud the mystery. So he stayed with the family in their cottage. It was quite a sort of cramped environment. Esther Cox was, more or less sort of the black sheep in the family, which is a very common thing in poltergeist cases. It seems as though she was sort of a bit jealous of her older and more attractive and popular sister Jenny. But she basically described the first night that it happened. It was she complained of there being like a mouse under the covers. She was in bed, and there seemed to be like a sort of a creature under the covers, and the activity just escalated from there. And all the usual effects where there were rapping noises on the walls and that kind of thing. In this case, the poltergeist seemed to be sort of particularly malevolent and violent. It really seemed to persecute the family. It really targeted them in a very sort of aggressive manner, and particularly Esther as well. And there was an incident there where there was a message was found scrawled on the wall which said, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill."
Mm.
Which was obviously very worrying to the family members and Esther. But basically, they started to communicate with the entity, and this is something we find in a lot of poltergeist cases where, the person will hear the rapping noises on the walls, and then they'll try to return the raps, and in some cases the supposed entity will respond, and they'll develop a code where they can communicate. And that was the case with this poltergeist. But the really worrying thing was when the poltergeist started to threaten to burn down the house. So, and then there were all these fires that would just sort of erupt in various parts of the house, and they had to race around and try and put them out. So they were basically in a state of constant fear with all these fires. Now the case did, of course, it fizzled out eventually, as we find in poltergeist cases. They only last for a certain period of time. Maybe it's 6 months, or maybe it'll drag out to a year or so. The activity seemed to be, Walter Hubble observed that it varied in accordance with a 28-day cycle. And that seems to suggest that it was related to Esther's menstrual cycle. So that sort of indicates a kind of sexual component there. And of course indicates too that the activity did originate from her, or the energy at least originated from her. And it also turns out too that just shortly before the activity erupted, Esther had had a very traumatic experience where she'd been seeing this young man named Bob McNeil, and he had basically tried to rape her at gunpoint. So she was very shocked by that incident, and then shortly afterwards, as I said, the activity erupted. So that certainly indicates too that it was certainly the activity was linked to her and possibly her subconscious mind, and there was certainly a sexual component there. She was very fond of that young man. Of course, obviously after the incident, she probably had second thoughts about him, but nonetheless, I think it's one of the most fascinating cases. It has all these interesting aspects. And the other thing too is the entity certainly it seemed to behave in a sort of an autonomous, independent fashion as well. So although it seemed to be related or connected to Esther in some way, it also seemed to be very much kind of independent of her. And as I said, she was very much targeted as well. She was very much kind of persecuted by this being or entity or whatever it was. So. But the fires, of course, are really fascinating, and that's certainly one of the most compelling cases where there's been, these sort of spontaneous fires. And I can talk about a few other cases as well, if you'd like. There was
absolutely.
So there was a case in 1932. It was it happened in Bladenboro in North Carolina, in the home of a man named Council H. Williamson and his wife Lydia. But basically, these fires just came out of nowhere, and over a 3-day period, there were some 20 fires that just sort of erupted spontaneously and inexplicably in various parts of the house. And the fires seemed to target specific items. It was generally like window shades, curtains, bedclothes, stacks of paper, and that sort of thing that seemed to be the target of the fires. And there was also an incident too where Williamson's daughter, or other accounts say it was actually his wife, she was standing there basically just in the middle of the floor, and she was wearing a dress, and then apparently this dress sort of just caught on fire completely out of nowhere, and they had to basically tear the garment off her body and trample out the flames. And we find a few other cases too where a person has been wearing clothing and such as a dress, for example, and the garment has just caught fire. In this case, she didn't actually suffer any burns to her body, which is very unusual. The flames were described as being bluish in color and similar to those from a gas jet. And the flame didn't seem to emit any smoke at all as well, which is quite peculiar. So it was a sort of bluish flame that didn't seem to emit any smoke. And this is something that we find in a lot of poltergeist cases. The flames are described in that manner. It's also something we find in cases of SHC as well. And there was a fascinating case too that was investigated by Guy Lyon Playfair. He was a British paranormal investigator. He of course wrote a famous book about the Enfield poltergeist called This House is Haunted, one of the most fascinating books ever written on the subject, in my opinion. So he talks about a fascinating case that occurred in Sao Paulo in Brazil. This was in 1970. It happened, of course, once again in a domestic environment, and there were, these fires erupting. And the police did investigate the case. They came and visited the home to have a look at it, and one of the police officers talked about seeing a mattress just sort of catch fire, and he talked about from what he could tell, the flames or the fire seemed to originate from within the center of the mattress, and he actually pulled the mattress off the bed. He cut it open, and he observed that there was, that it was glowing hot like coals inside, and there was couldn't actually see any sort of flame present, but it seemed to be kind of smoldering, burning from within, which
that's
is very
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, in cases of SHC, it seems to be an internal process. The flames seem to originate from within the person. So once again, there's this fascinating crossover between spontaneous human combustion and these, very strange poltergeist fires. And the other thing too is, of course, in poltergeist fires, the fires seem to target very specific items, and they don't seem to spread necessarily. So an object will burn, but then it won't, spread to surrounding objects. So there's definitely there's definitely a connection there between these poltergeist fires and spontaneous human combustion.
Yeah, that makes an enormous amount of sense.
Yeah.
And again, I never would have connected poltergeist activity to spontaneous human combustion. It's not something that even would have clicked into my head. You also talk about people with spontaneous human combustion seem to go into a trance, as well as people who, are experience poltergeist activity are usually in that liminal state, or sometimes jump into a trance state as well while the poltergeist activity is happening.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So there does seem to be definitely a connection there between the person entering an altered state of consciousness and the activity occurring. There have been cases of SHC where, as I said, there have been people who have witnessed it happening to a person, and time and again we find that they describe that person, the victim, entering a kind of trance state. They seem to sort of go into an altered state of consciousness, and then that's when the activity erupts, the flames erupt, and then once that person comes out of that altered state of consciousness, they can't actually remember the event. They have no recollection of it. So they seem to enter this very, sort of deep, kind of a trance state, if you will. And in the case of, poltergeistry, we find, as I mentioned, the activity seems to erupt, particularly when the family members are either falling asleep or waking up. So they're in that sort of, that very much that liminal state of consciousness. Either the hypnagogic state, which is just when you're falling asleep, or the hypnopompic state when you're waking up. So all of this activity, it seems to happen. Certainly, when the person is not necessarily in the normal waking state, they're in some altered state of consciousness, and certainly too, when people talk about electric people, when they talk about these inexplicable things happening to electrical equipment, they talk about not necessarily being in an altered state of consciousness, or sometimes they do talk about that as well, but they talk about being in a particular emotional state. They could be quite depressed, or they could be quite troubled about something at the time that the activity occurs. So certainly one's emotions have something to do with it, and that their state of consciousness. So and once again, that sort of indicates that maybe it is the subconscious mind where this activity erupts from, I suppose. Because we're very much the subconscious, there's all sorts of things happening within our minds that we're not completely aware of, and they it can sort of manifest in strange kind of ways. I mean, you'd even find too, for example, that you feel as though you're completely fine, that you're you can say, oh, I'm perfectly happy and okay, but there could be something really kind of troubling you. and then you could be talking to a friend or something, and then you'll suddenly there'll be an angry outburst or something like that, and it's
Right.
really it's the subconscious manifesting. There's something troubling you, but you're not necessarily aware of it.
You're not dealing with it. Yeah.
Exactly, it hasn't been processed in the proper manner, and therefore it erupts in that sort of kind of a destructive kind of way, I suppose. Hmm.
Yeah, emotions definitely play a part. The
Yeah.
same girlfriend where the computer would crash between us, if we were in the
Yep.
car and we got into a fight, even for a second, the car would quit.
Right.
And
Okay. Yep.
it would usually take a couple of days, and then the car would be fine again. It was really weird
Mm.
because no one could ever find anything wrong with it, but the car wouldn't restart.
Yeah.
And once this happened in like sub-zero temperatures in, like 6 a.m. in the morning, and it took forever for anyone to come out and get us, and it was horrible.
Yeah.
But and again, went to the mechanic. The mechanic found absolutely nothing wrong with it. And like 2 days later, it just started back up and ran fine again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Right.
emotions do play a part in this, and Shirley Black can definitely attest to that as well. She
Yeah.
has all kinds. Anytime she gets emotional, stuff goes crazy around her.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a section in the last section. You basically deal with anomalous lights, UFOs, ball lightning, stuff like that. And I definitely want to get to this before we're done here. Now, ball lightning is one of those things that sometimes people will connect to spontaneous human combustion. And you show that it does have some vague connections here and there, but it doesn't necessarily explain it.
No, not necessarily. First of all, I'll just say that ball lightning is it is a deeply mysterious phenomenon. I mean, it's really not that uncommon. A lot of people have seen ball lightning, but basically they're these sort of small. Generally, they're described as being sort of about the size of a sort of a grapefruit. They can vary in size. These basically described as like a ball of fire, and they typically manifest during sort of thunderstorm activity. Usually after there's been like a lightning strike to the ground, someone will then see these. Basically, they just sort of seem to manifest out of nowhere, and sometimes they have like a hissing sound. Sometimes they have a distinct odor, generally described as like ozone or burning sulfur or nitric oxide. And they manifest. They only stick around for very short periods of time, so it's usually around 5 to 10 seconds. So they'll be present, and then they'll basically what's usually described as the object just suddenly explodes or disappears. So it's a very short-lived phenomenon. So when people do see ball lightning, as I said, it's only for a very brief period of time, around 5 to 10 seconds. But it's very mysterious because people have described seeing ball lightning perform all of these feats that sort of seem to more or less kind of contradict the known laws of physics. So sometimes they will, pass straight through walls and ceilings. Sometimes they'll leave, holes in panes of glass. They've been known to materialize inside aircraft, even squeeze through keyholes as well. So there's descriptions of ball lightning basically sort of changing its shape and kind of turning into a sort of elongated object in order to be able to pass straight through the keyhole of a door. So all of this really, really weird stuff. Another thing too is they seem to enter. The ball lightning seems very fond of entering homes via the chimney as well. That's something that we find as well. Sometimes they'll enter the house via an open window or something like that. There's been cases where the object seems to exhibit some kind of intelligence or sentience. So the object, for example, will enter, in a very slow, methodical, calm manner. It will enter the house via the window. It'll just sort of, basically circle the room, kind of seem to explore the environment, maybe circle around a person or something like that, and then it will just sort of leave via the window again. So that seems to suggest that there's some kind of intelligence on the part of the object. And another thing too is the crossover between ball lightning and the Foo Fighter phenomenon. And they were these basically these playful balls of light that the pilots saw during World War II. And so they describe seeing these objects sort of basically approach their aircraft, and they'd seem to exhibit very sort of inquisitive, playful kind of behavior. They'd try to outmaneuver the objects or try to chase them and that sort of thing, and they're never successful. The objects would just suddenly shoot off or something like that. They almost seem to be playing games with the pilots. Now, they thought that they were some kind of Nazi secret weapon, but as it turns out, the Japanese and the Germans also observed these strange objects, these Foo Fighters. Once again, the descriptions of the Foo Fighters and certain descriptions of ball lightning, they seem to be very much connected. We seem to be dealing with the same thing. And Vincent Gaddis came up with the theory that maybe in the case of the Foo Fighters, it was actually some kind of intelligent high-altitude form of ball lightning. But to get to your original question about SHC, the theory that maybe ball lightning is responsible for SHC, there is some evidence to support that. We do know, of course, that ball lightning can injure people. It can cause severe burns and charred flesh and that sort of thing. Usually, though, there's sort of really no heat associated with the object. Usually, of course, people just sort of, they get stung by it. So they'll just sort of get, a bit of a zap from the object, but it doesn't actually really cause any extensive damage. There was a famous case of a physicist in 1753, George William Reichmann. He was a physicist Swedish physicist. He was living in Russia at the time. He'd set up an experiment where he had like a rod connected to his house. And there was a thunderstorm present. He basically went straight to his house when the storm appeared, and then he went to take some measurements from the rod, and then of course this object, this ball of light, just sort of emerged from the end of the rod, and it struck his body and hit him straight in the forehead, and he basically died instantly. Probably what happened in that case is it was sort of electric shock that would have basically stopped his heart. That's probably what happened. So that's the most. But when we look at the potential crossover there with SHC, there are some cases where there was a famous case. It was reported in 1961 issue of Fate magazine by an American reverend named Wintergene Savage, and he said that the brother of one of his friends basically woke up at around 5 a.m., heard his wife screaming. He followed her screams into the living room, and then he saw his wife lying on the floor. She was burning fiercely, and there was a ball of light hovering above her body. So they tried to put out the flames. The wife was badly burned, so that seems to suggest that maybe something like ball lightning caused her to burst into flames. She actually died, of course. And it also, one other detail too that's mentioned is the fact that her clothing was destroyed by the fire and the rug beneath her, but the room itself suffered very little damage. But I think that probably the most compelling case was one that happened in 1978. There were 5 mountaineers. They were at an altitude of around 3,900 meters. It was in a region of the Caucasus Mountains in Russia. And they talked about seeing this very strange yellow blob, is how they described it. And basically it entered their tent, and then in a very deliberate, methodical fashion, it entered, as it entered their, actually got into their sleeping bags, sort of kind of took turns going into each sleeping bag, and they were, screaming in pain. It was apparently an incredibly painful, traumatic experience for them. They suffered such severe burning that there was like chunks of muscle torn from their bones, and one of the hikers actually died from that incident. So that's a possible case of ball lightning or something akin to ball lightning causing, SHC. And then there was another famous.
But at the same time, they didn't burst. They didn't burst into flames either. They just had burns on them.
No, that's correct. But the theory is that possibly what happens is, because ball lightning can simply manifest basically out of nowhere. It can just sort of appear all of a sudden, possibly what's happening is it's actually manifesting inside the body of a person.
Right.
So that's a possibility. So maybe in the case of SHC, that's what's actually happening. That person just happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then this ball lightning will basically manifest inside of them and then cause the burning to occur. But yeah, of course, it's just a theory. I just wanted to mention too that the Mary Hardy Reisa case, really fascinating aspect of that is the fact that the police received a unsigned letter. It was just a few days after the incident, and someone talked about. So on this letter, this person chose to remain anonymous. They talked about seeing a ball of fire come through the open window and then strike Mrs. Reisa. So it's possible too that ball lightning was the cause of her death. So there's this really fascinating connection there, but there's really very little hard evidence to support that theory. So it's a little bit frustrating because we find these cases where there's just a little bit of evidence offered, but it's certainly not enough to sort of draw any conclusions as to whether or not ball lightning is responsible for certain cases of SHC.
Well, perhaps the ball lightning and whatever is causing the SHC are related energy, even if it's not ball lightning causing it. Like if it is sort of an unconscious suicide thing, maybe they're creating something from the same energy that ball lightning is created from.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one possibility. I mean, it was ball lightning. The most theories of ball lightning suggest that it's some form of high density plasma.
Right.
Which is basically like an ionized gas. So yeah, absolutely. Maybe the human body is capable of producing something like that, some kind of energy, I suppose, or form of plasma, I suppose, which then causes the process. It's an interesting theory. Yeah, absolutely.
I love the fact that you get into the idea that plasma may be conscious in here. It's an idea I first came across from Andrew Collins' work, Alien Energy, and then Light Quest, where he talks about intelligent plasma possibly being the explanation for UFOs and such. But you definitely explore a lot of different stuff with that idea in this book.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I must admit too, that's certainly one of the most fascinating books that I've read on UFOs. I really think that his take on it is really it's because certainly I don't see much evidence for the the extraterrestrial hypothesis. We seem to be dealing with something other than extraterrestrials in the case of UFOs. And we're dealing with a whole range of different things as well. I mean, I use the term anomalous lights to refer to these things because we're not necessarily always dealing with sightings of I suppose like structured craft or something like that. Generally, what's described could just be simply a ball of light, sometimes quite a small object. And these things are sort of described in very similar terms to ball lightning. And as I said too, there could be an intelligent form of ball lightning, because when we use the term ball lightning, it seems as though we're really referring to a whole range of different things. There could be all different types of ball lightning with very different kind of characteristics.
Yeah.
And also there's other things as well. There's there's earth lights, for example, which are basically sort of really related to sort of a specific location. The lights will manifest again and again.
Right.
Like the Marfa lights in Texas, for example.
The Brown Mountain lights.
Brown Mountain lights, etc. So it seems to be related to something that is special about that area. Geologically, there could be, say, deposits of minerals. There could be a lake or a dam or a stream or something like that. Some sort of body of water, which is maybe playing a role in the production of those lights. And also, fault lines as well. That certainly seems to be one of the other factors too. That
yes.
But the really, when we talk about earth lights, ball lightning, etc., I'm not necessarily saying that these things are, just simply some form of energy that's produced by the earth. We can't discount the fact that in a lot of these reports, people talk about the objects really exhibiting some kind of intelligence or sentience. So there does seem to be an intelligent component to this. So, maybe these lights are produced by the Earth, or the energy comes from the Earth, but nonetheless there is some kind of sentience. And it's also possible too, and I think this is a really interesting theory, that maybe it's a way for entities from other dimensions or realities to sort of cross over into our reality. Maybe they need some kind of suit or clothing, if you like, in order to, or some kind of physical vehicle to be able to enter our dimensions. So maybe that's what they use. Maybe they use plasma as a kind of vehicle, if you like, to enter our reality. I know it's a pretty outlandish theory, but nonetheless, I think it's a really interesting one.
No, so do I. So do I. And it could also be that it's the form that consciousness takes from somewhere else when it enters here.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, you delve into a lot of that stuff. Have you are you aware of Robert Schoch's work on psychic phenomena, where he connects solar cycles to the rise and fall of psychic phenomena? Like psychics tested over the last 100 years or so will always perform better during high solar activity.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, I've certainly read some of his work. Yep. Not necessarily on that particular topic, but I know what you're referring to. Yeah.
And that again, I mean, that's again electrical in nature. So it may be setting something off where, like, I wonder if you looked at spontaneous human combustion cases, if they'd correlate to high solar activity.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to investigate. I know that Larry Arnold, who's sort of really one of the probably the world's leading expert on SHC, he wrote a sort of very much an encyclopedic book on the phenomenon. But he talks about, what is it, like fire lanes, like ley lines. But he basically, he's certainly done some research into that, basically looking into whether or not these events occur, in certain locations on the globe where, possibly ley lines intersect and that kind of thing. So, which I think is very interesting. I mean, in my book, I sort of really kind of, I really sort of discuss the subconscious suicide theory. That's really kind of my take on it. But certainly there could be so many different factors involved, and there could be energies involved that are related to the Earth as well. So we, and as you said too, maybe it is related to solar activity or something of that nature as well.
Well, I'm wondering if, like the energy to create this sort of suicide is more likely to manifest during high solar activity. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just that subconscious suicide thing kicks in because there's more energy available to somebody. But I really like the subconscious suicide theory. It is a brilliant explanation for this. The book, you have all the supporting evidence there with poltergeist cases and so on and so forth. This is incredible. How long did it take you to write this?
Well, I'd been working on it for a while, sort of on and off. I mean, I was, sort of working full time when I was writing that book, and I just had to sort of write during the evenings and that kind of thing. But yeah, I suppose all up, it probably would have taken a couple of years to write the book. In fact, I have actually been criticized for that by academics and people like that who've said, "Oh gosh, only took him a couple of years to write it. Therefore, he probably rushed it or something like that." Because I guess in their case, they probably take many, many years to research and write a book. But in my case, it's all of my books are very much connected. So all of these things tie together, and I think that's the really important. That's a very important thing to remember, and that's why I explore those three areas. SHC, poltergeistry, and anomalous lights, and I wanted to show, the extent to which these things overlap. and how they're, very much deeply connected. So it's very much a process of connecting the dots for me. That's kind of how I approach it. And sometimes academics and people of that nature, who have that kind of mindset, they kind of seem to miss that. I feel, they want to put things in, distinct categories.
Right. Right.
Whereas I think it's, we need to look at all the various connections and the overlaps and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And when it
Mhm.
comes to lights and stuff, lights are another thing that seem to be in most paranormal experience. Like, and I've always
Yep.
said that, if you see a light in a house, it's a ghost. If you see a light in the sky, it's an alien.
Yep.
But in the end, it's a light, and we should start with that.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
so you first of all, this book is a great read. It's well
Mhm.
written. It's well researched. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I recommend people go out and pick it up. It's called Borderland Phenomena, Volume 1, Spontaneous Combustion, Poltergeistry, and Anomalous Lights. Now, you're working on Volume 2 currently?
I'm currently doing, research for volume 2. Um, so yeah, that's certainly in the works. I'm not too sure when it's going to be published. But yeah, my intention is to write a whole series of books. And in volume 2, I'm hoping to look at or explore mysterious disappearances, and
Mm,
also, look a little bit more at various theories of the multiverse as well. As I said, I do feel that these things have a sort of an other dimensional origin.
yeah.
That they're very much sort of based in another reality, but they sometimes spill over into our reality. So I'll be kind of exploring that in more detail as well. So it's going to continue on from volume 1.
I really look forward to it. If it's anywhere near as good as this one,
Okay.
I'm really eager to see what you come up with.
Okay.
Where can people follow you online?
So I have a website or blog, which is louisproud.net. I'm also on Twitter as well. You can follow me on Twitter. So that's Louis Proud too. Um, and also, on my website, I've got my contact details available. Certainly, if anyone wants to contact me, and if they have a paranormal experience they'd like to tell me about, I'm certainly open to hearing that. So yeah, you can certainly find me online, and Borderland Phenomena Volume 1 is available, from Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those online bookshops, Book Depository, etc. So it's quite easy to find. And of course, there's the ebook version as well as the hard copy as well. So yeah, absolutely. And as I said, if anyone wants to contact me, I'm certainly a you know fairly open-minded individual. I love hearing from people and etc. So absolutely, just send me an email, etc. And yeah, I've also got a whole other range of books as well. There's Strange Electromagnetic Dimensions is one that you mentioned.
Hmm.
And my first book, Dark Intrusions. I also wrote a book on the moon too, called The Secret Influence of the Moon. So it's all of this stuff is available. But yeah, no, thank you very much for having me on the show today, Seriah. It's been a fascinating discussion. I always feel too when I have these discussions that there's just so much to cover, and it's kind of hard to really have a discussion
Squeeze it
around
in.
these. Yeah, exactly, and have a
Yeah.
discussion around these topics because it's so complex and multifaceted, and it's so easy to kind of go off on tangents here and there because there's just so much to this stuff. It's almost as though the human mind isn't really equipped to be able to understand these things at all. So we're really, and
Well,
that's why it is challenging. It's challenging to talk about these things in such a way that you don't sound completely bonkers. Um, I do. I mean, that's the reason I write books too. It's to try and explain these things in detail, try to kind of structure the information. When I do talk about this stuff, it can be very, very challenging to find the
yes.
right words. And all this stuff, it's deeply baffling and mysterious. And I feel too that the point isn't to try and necessarily explain all this stuff, because maybe we can't at this point in time certainly explain it, but we can at least have fun exploring it and making some kind of attempt to explain it.
Find a
It's
cou-
all about
find a couple more puzzle pieces.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's absolutely correct. I think that's a good metaphor. Yes. Yeah.
And find better questions to ask, because I think
Mm.
the quintessential issues, we don't understand what reality really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And there could be multiple realities, other universes
Mm-hmm.
interacting with
Mm-hmm.
our own, which just makes things even more, more complex, more baffling as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much. Is it Lewis or Louis?
So you'd pronounce it Louis. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so
Okay.
much, Louis.
All
This has
right.
been a fascinating conversation.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me on the show, Soraya.
And a special shout out to our patrons pledging $10 or more: Allison Cook, Lindsay Marie Trebet, Nick Martin, Super Inframan, UFO Weekly News, Tim, Maria, Nate Seriah, Jennifer Campbell, Mike McGuire, American Rambler, Paul Buscini, Kevin, Chris Johnson, 36 Dingo, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Ben Crow, Janet Runyon, Andy McNamara, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, Rogelio Gonzalez, Anthony Sullivan, Roland Belstadt, Robert Groom, Sean Cosgrove, Jose A., Craig Sisternos, Charles Beauregard, Matthias Sunby, Lindsey Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris, John Eddy, and Carla Mahoney. Thank you all so very much. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. I've been wanting to talk to Lewis for a long time, and I definitely recommend his book, Borderland Phenomena. It was honestly hard to put down, very well written, and very interesting connections he makes there. And hopefully we'll have him back for a more free exchange of ideas sometime soon. Yeah, he definitely has researched some similar stuff to what we have, dealing in, anomalous lights and poltergeist activity and sleep paralysis and such. It seems like we're walking similar paths and picking up on different stuff. So it should be interesting to have him just come on and throw around ideas with us, speculate a little. Hopefully I can make that happen. All right. The day before I recorded this, I went back down to Tim Renner's, and we did another trip over to Site 7, this time with Josh Cutchin, because they were going to go to a conference this last weekend in Rhode Island. So Josh had flown up to Tim's to spend a couple of days, and I went down, and we went over to Site 7, and we did see some anomalous lights. We have no idea what they were, but they were not the distinct lights that Tim had reported seeing earlier. We spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes there, and we all saw flashes of light, almost similar to fireflies, but there were no fireflies, and fireflies tend to blink out, blink back on, etc. These would be on and then gone. So unless the audio picked up something weird, unfortunately, we couldn't get anything on film, because it would be quick, and then it would be gone, and then it would appear somewhere else quick, and then be gone. The place has an interesting feel, I'll say that, but I wonder if it just kind of cycles up and down with activity like a lot of places do. So, we went back and we played the game of Bigfoot. Now, you may have seen that board game if you watched the video of Tim's art and everything. I point out there's a Bigfoot game sitting there. Well, Josh decided we should do a show and play Bigfoot. So I took a 360 camera and I put it in the middle of the board. And we played Bigfoot while I talked to them about their new Bigfoot book. It's, it's a little gimmicky, but it was fun. I'm putting it only out for patrons, so patrons will get both the audio if you don't want to sit through the video, or the video where you can kind of literally be in the middle of a round table with us. We also took the 360 camera on a walk down Toad Road, so I'm going to put that up for patrons as well. If you want to become a patron, it's a minimum of $3 a month, and you get all kinds of extra content like this. And usually extra stuff from most of the interviews I do. Louis, I guess, had to go, so I didn't get to do a Patreon segment with him. But instead, you get to watch us play the Bigfoot game, for better or worse. Anyway, see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons. And we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.